This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Treasures in Haystacks and Wishes on Stars by Anonymous, composed by Burning Aurora, Kaliana, and Flowerhawk. Sirius had been running for what felt like hours by the time he stumbled upon a gas station in the middle of nowhere. His feet were bare on the tarmac and raw and bloody from running, but he'd been telling himself he had to keep going since he'd left his family home. He had to outrun them. Regulus had only given him an hour's warning. They were in cars. They might even bring the dogs. He was on foot. As far as he was concerned, he was more than a little behind. He stifled a sob at that last image of Regulus in the doorway to the servants' entry, calling out a hissed,
"I love you. Be safe."
As Sirius had stumbled out, still coming to terms with what was happening really, bleary with sleep and the medicines they had given him, forcing his feet to move past the sluggish haze that would be his undoing if he let it. The last 24 hours had been a challenge to digest, and this was just the latest in a long line of things he was trying to process as he resolutely kept moving one foot after the other. It had all started when he'd woken up the morning before feeling groggy and fevered. He was sore all over and nauseous, and no amount of ginger tea was helping. He fainted in the shower, and when Regulus finally helped him convince their mother he wasn't faking it, the doctor had finally been called. What followed was a thorough and invasive assessment by a doctor that wouldn't even look him in the eye, and then a series of whispered conversations that Sirius wasn't privy to, until someone finally gave him a sleeping draft to help him drift off. The next thing he knew, Sirius was being shaken awake by his little brother, repeating over and over through the fog that it had finally happened, that he was officially presenting as an Omega. That terror was amplified the moment Sirius got a good look at Regulus's face. Then he knew. A price had already been agreed on. They already had an alpha in mind for him.
"You need to run."
Wah!
"It's not good, Siri.
Reg had said urgently.
They want to sell you to some arsehole for political capital. You need to go."
He'd shoved his pocket money into Sirius's hands, manhandled him to the servants' entry, and shoved him outside, leaving Sirius to connect the dots as he stumbled. Omega. Presented. Sold. And as those ideas solidified in his brain, his feet began to move quicker. Omega. He'd had his suspicions after all. They all had. But he'd still hoped he'd be a beta. Until he presented, there was always a chance. But he was never going to be an alpha. Regulus was taller than him by the time he hit 15. He was more slender and soft in build than his younger brother and other alpha relatives as well, and he'd always been known as the pretty one, sometimes in complimentary, and other times not so complimentary terms. His parents had never respected him the way they did Regulus, and when his 19th year had begun, they'd all watched and waited. And now, he understood that they'd been preparing all along. Sold. The idea made him feel sick. Nothing, not anything, would convince him that the fate of the other Omegas in his family, Narcissa, Andromeda, and even his mother, was a life worth having. Stuffed away in manor houses, forbidden from seeing the light of day outside of official engagements until they produced an heir, subjected to whatever their alpha might want or do to them with no recourse due to their own traitorous biology. So he ran, until the thumping of his feet against the road and the pounding of his heart drowned out any remaining feelings of betrayal and pain and residual nausea of preheat, until the early evening had deepened into freezing pitch darkness only lit by the moon above. Then suddenly the darkness was split by a warmer light up ahead, and a lonely gas station, population 1 car and 1 red pickup truck grew steadily closer with every step. He knew without even thinking that this would be his chance, his one true chance at getting far enough away that his family wouldn't find him. He only stopped running when the tarmac transitioned to concrete under his feet, and he was behind the pickup piled high with hay. It was still running, but no one was inside. A panting, quick look through the window of the servo confirmed only the presence of a bored-looking attendant. Whoever the pickup belonged to must be in the bathroom. With only the thought that he was freezing and exhausted, and that the hay looked so soft, Sirius used the last of his strength to hop up the sides of the pickup and worm his way into the dry, fragrant hay, hoping that the truck would take him even further than his feet in the right direction, and that when he was inevitably discovered, they'd take pity and help. He couldn't make out any scent other than the dry grass, not the gag-worthy, cloying scent of an alpha like that of his father and uncles, just sweet, earthy hay. He tried to cover himself with as much of it as he could, finding a soft spot where a bale had come loose and made a kind of mattress to sleep on. He closed his eyes and was asleep in minutes. Once upon a time, when he was still a weedy boy, Remus had been pitching hay for the horses to find that their sweet old dog Mooney had had a litter of puppies behind one of the bales. They had been all sorts of colors, Mooney being a mutt and their sire being God knew what breed, but there had been one little pup that was perfectly jet black from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. His mum and da had let him keep that little black beauty, giving away the rest, and he'd called it Padfoot because the little pink pads of its feet were the only color on it, besides the deep brown of its dopey eyes. Ever since, he'd thought of the haystacks and bales as lucky. There was something about the smell, earthy and pure, cool in the summer, but insulating and warm in the winter. He'd found lots of little treasures in the loose grass over the years, little nests of mice he'd gently moved into boxes padded with sawdust, kittens that his mother had adored and kept to help with pest control. It was a running joke that every time Remus stuck his big, calloused hands in the hay, he found something he could love a little bit more. So maybe he should have been less surprised when he arrived at the farm after a long drive out for hay and the special jam his mum liked so much, and found him under a bale. He was nestled between the grass, asleep and as pale as the moon, and wearing not nearly enough clothes for the early winter cold. He was covered only by thin pajama bottoms and a ratty band tee. His lips were blue and his feet were bloody and raw, but Remus thought he'd never seen anything he liked the look of more. He was obviously in some trouble if the state of his dress and feet were anything to go by. Safe people didn't hop into random people's pickup trucks and hide in the hay. He must have been desperate. He noticed he was shivering, and no wonder, so he hopped up into the bed of the truck and crouched down to look at him closer. A beauty indeed, with delicate, almost angelic features, thick black hair hastily tied back and full pink lips. He reached out a hand to touch him, to rouse him, and then he smelled it. Burned butter, nutmeg syrup, and flaky pastry. Slightly salty and not too sweet, but rich and melt-in-your-mouth delicious. Wholesome and Moorish and comforting in that fresh-from-the-oven goodness. He was an omega, and if he wasn't already in heat, he was practically on its doorstep. He exhaled shakily, his shoulders suddenly tense as his alpha raised its head and took notice. He shook himself, and the man shifted slightly in the hay, causing a fresh waft of that smell to reach him, and he was nearly drooling by that point. A once-over told him that the darkening of his pants had nothing to do with the nighttime dew, and everything to do with the slick trickling down his thighs and wetting the fabric. His hand hovered over the bare and goose-pimpled arm, moved to touch the skin, but then he stopped himself. The human, thinking side of his brain intervened and told him that this was probably why the Omega was on the run in the first place. He was young, at least a couple years younger than Remus's 25 years, probably just presented, and what he needed was safety. Somewhere to go through his heat without an alpha asserting himself and taking away even more of his agency. His hormones had already done that enough, without Remus making it worse. And with that thought, and an irritated harumph from his alpha, he scooped the man up into his arms, hopped down off the bed of the truck, and made his way toward the farmhouse, where he knew his mother was waiting, trying to pay no heed to the animal in his chest, roaring its hunger at the way the Omega curled into his chest and sighed in contentment. The dying of an engine and a frigid breeze giving him cold sweats. The dip of the truck bed and the sound of boots coming closer. A gasp and the radiating heat of a warm body close by. Warm, strong arms holding him to a broad and comfortable chest. Cold air giving way to warm yellow light and the smell of a log burner. Muttered words, one deep and delicious, the other soft and lilting. Soft feminine sounds of tutting, hot running water and gentle touches soothing his stinging feet. The give of a mattress warmed by a hot water bottle, and the smell of goose down and hay as he's enveloped in a cocoon of warmth. Sweet warm oblivion. Sirius woke after a long slumber to find the light already low in the sky, as if it was already early evening again. There was a sound of whining by his head that was responsible for waking him up, and turned his head to find two brown eyes over a graying black snoot resting on the mattress. When the dog saw he was awake, it began to wag its tail happily, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. In the brief moments between unconsciousness and true awakeness, Sirius tried to parcel out where he was and why he was so comfortable, when the last thing he remembered was nearly freezing to death in the back of a pickup truck surrounded by hay. He reached a hand out to pat the snoot of the dog looking at him with big, sappy eyes and inhaled deeply. Hay, wood smoke, hard work, and sweat. He suddenly realized how warm he was, but when he kicked off the duvet, it barely made a dent. He felt feverish, but instead of the terror from the night before as he'd run, he felt only an overwhelming longing that went into his very bones. He rolled over on the mattress and pressed his face into the pillow, looking for the scent that put him in mind of arms he vaguely remembered carrying him from the hay into the warm. The smell was all around him, but in a kind of stale way, like bread that had been left out in the air and left to go dry. He needed it fresh from the source, and he needed it now. A peek out of his cocoon revealed that he was in a bedroom. It was comfortable in a kind of mismatched, cozy way. Nothing was overly lavish, but all the furniture looked sturdy. There was a bookshelf across the room from the bed that was bursting at the seams and with trinkets and photos littered on top of it. Curious and trying to take his mind off the low-grade nausea, he swung his legs out of the bed, noting he was no longer in his own PJs from the night before, but a borrowed pair of gray joggers and sans a shirt, and got to his feet. That was when he realized that the raw soles of his feet were bandaged and covered with woolen socks that looked hand-knitted. Someone had gone to the trouble of bathing and dressing him as well as tending to his ills while he was asleep, and he didn't know whether to feel grateful or exposed. He gingerly made his way over to the bookshelf, followed by the dog that he absently scratched the ears of as he snooped. In amongst the dishes of coins and other bric-a-brac, there were 3 photos on the surface of the shelves. One showed a family of 3 in an informal photograph. One of the people was a very tall man with a stern but kind face, thick stubble, and dark brown curls. He looked like he was trying not to laugh at the pretty flaxen-haired woman next to him that came roughly to his bicep. She was smirking down at a boy of about 13 who was his father in a smaller body. She was behind him with her hands on his shoulders, and he was grinning as if she'd just told a joke. His hair was a dark blonde like hers, but with the same curls as his father. His legs were long and knobby, and he was almost as tall as her. The next photo was of the boy again, maybe a few years younger, holding a puppy that he supposed was the younger version of the pooch, now nudging his hand for attention, tail thumping against the carpet. The boy's face was looking adoringly at the little puppy. His eyes were soft, and Sirius felt a pang and a throbbing between his legs. The third photo was of the boy now turned into a gorgeous man of around 25, laughing next to an attractive girl around the same age with coppery hair and freckles at a pub. Through the smile he wore in the photo, Sirius could tell his eyes were brown. That longing, and even a hint of jealousy, returned with a vengeance at the photo, and he fought the urge to keen like a wounded animal as he looked at the easy dynamic between the family, as well as the attractive man and ginger girl. That smile was a magnet, and Sirius wanted to stick to it closer than any force could justify. The scent still around him, and those eyes and the memory of a deep, soothing voice against him made him positively ache with want. He looked around desperately and found a hamper spilling over with articles of clothing and made a beeline for it. He dug through until he found a jumper that smelled fresh enough, probably a few hours old, and hurriedly put it on, feeling the immediately soothing effect of the fresher scent close to his skin. He found himself moving toward the door to the room, curious to explore, but more importantly, responding to the pull in his belly that said he needed to find the man in the photos. He found himself at the end of a landing by a staircase. Lining the old-fashioned wallpaper of the wall by the stairs were even more photos to peruse. They were nothing like the photos in his own family home. Those had all been formal and posed. Wedding photos and christenings and significant birthdays marked with portraits that Sirius hated to look at. He'd stopped being photographed with his brother the moment it became clear they would not both be presenting as alphas. After he'd been surpassed in height and stature, Sirius had been included in the family photos and none others. He'd been hidden away with the other omegas and betas unless it had been absolutely necessary, pulled out of school and placed into omega finishing classes that he'd found creative ways to bunk out of. Omegas and suspected omegas were not a part of polite society in any meaningful way. They were afforded no bodily autonomy or private property. They were allowed no journals to write in or novels to read. Even while Berga was hamstrung at every turn, Sirius had always assumed that was why she was such a consummate bitch to him. She had no other power over anyone or anything else in her life. Only Regulus had treated him with any dignity after he'd been pulled out of school. Once there had been a boy with messy hair and glasses named James who Sirius had been friends with, but after he turned 15, he never saw him again. Suspected Omegas weren't permitted to have alpha or suspected alpha friends outside of their families. But the photos on the stairwell showed something very different. The woman in the photo in the room featured in almost all of them, cuddling a smaller iteration of the boy from the photos, being playfully chased by the man, or kicking a ball into a net. There was even a photo of her at a graduation event, and in every photo she was in, she smiled widely. She looked happy. This woman, presumably an Omega as well, if the smells in the house were any indication, had lived a full life, documented by the photos decorating this home, which stood as a monument to her freedom. Before he descended the stairs, he looked into the second room and deduced it immediately as the main room, but there were no bars on the windows, no restraints by the bed. The room showed signs of regular use, but it was sunny and comfortable, with its own shelf of books and a comfortable chair to read in. When he made his way downstairs, he found more cozy living spaces connecting to a farmhouse dining room that looked into a kitchen through an archway over a peekaboo counter. The dog seemed to lead him there, and he followed it into a space that looked loved and smelled even lovelier, like home-cooked food and fresh flowers. The dog found a bed by the coal stove and curled up, and Sirius went to give it a final scratch when something caught his eye. On the small breakfast nook table lay a notepad with a handwritten message.
Gone to have dinner with the Evanses. Took the gin with me, so we'll spend the night. Dinner is in the oven. Lots of love, Ma. Heart emoticon.
Sirius blinked as he read. This woman had agency. She had freedom. She was allowed to drink alcohol and visit with friends and go where she pleased, unchaperoned for a night. His fever, forgotten while he snooped, intensified as he realized that what he'd come to expect from life wasn't the only option, and that longing he had felt at the beautiful man in the photograph expanded until it threatened to flatten him with want. He realized that wanting the man in the photos, and he did, meant accepting the possibility of having this life, and he wanted that too. He wanted the freedom and respect afforded to this Omega woman without denying his nature and preferences. He wanted a family born out of love and choice, not obligation. He wanted to raise children without fear over what their subgender would be. And he wanted an alpha who saw him as a person first, not a hole to be plugged and filled. He wanted the affection he saw in the photos and the comfort and simplicity of a home he made. The true onset of his heat was accompanied with desperation so potent it made him grip the back of the chair he stood by until his knuckles went white and his fingernails splintered the wood grain. His skin burned and itched, and he felt so empty. He staggered to the door of the farmhouse, out of the warmth and into the November chill, with no real idea of where he was going. All he knew was need. All he knew was he needed the source of the smell, of the life he'd never known he could have. He went looking for a man with warm eyes and a smile like sunshine who had saved him and healed his wounds when he needed him most. He dragged his socked feet over dirt and around puddles, not even noticing when his socks got wet, drawn inexorably toward a redwood barn not far from the farmhouse, sensing rather than smelling that what he was looking for was inside. The scent got stronger the closer he got to the barn, where the sound of rhythmic shoveling grew louder as he approached. When he got to the doorway, he could only slump against the solid wood of the wall. He was there. He was real. The boy with the tawny curls in the photos, now a man before him in flesh and bone, with broad, strong shoulders and a jumper rolled up to the elbows as he worked. He was as tall as he looked in the pictures, legs long in his worn denim and feet protected by mud-caked gumboots. The back of his neck glistened with light sweat, and as he moved, the smell of him intensified, making Sirius's mouth water. His belly ached anew, and he was so empty it hurt. He felt his thighs grow wet with slick, and he didn't even have it in him to feel embarrassed when he saw the smell reach the man, and he froze with his back to Sirius. He could almost tell when he inhaled, and his heart rate spiked when he turned slowly, as if in a trance, turning the biggest, warmest brown eyes to look at him. Remus could smell him before he'd even turned toward the sound of stumbling into the barn. He turned as if on autopilot in time to see the man from the night before, now wrapped in his clothes and leaning against the door to the barn. His cheeks were pink, and the gray fleece of his borrowed joggers was dark and wet between his legs. The smell of him rolled in like a wave, and Remus almost staggered when it hit him. He smelled like scones freshly out of the oven, buttery and heavenly, good enough to devour even if the steam burned the roof of your mouth.
It's you.
His voice was melodic, like the Debussy his mother loved to play when it rained, and starlight if it could open its mouth and speak. It took him several attempts to reply.
You were in my truck last night.
And I woke up in your bed.
He countered.
You bandaged my feet.
Remus tried to clear his throat but couldn't dislodge the lump that had taken residence there. His mouth was watering.
My ma, she bathed and took care of you.
The man was looking at him intently, questioningly. Remus stammered to continue, breathless under that intense look.
I slept in the barn.
He hurried to explain as the man stepped further into the barn. He shook a little as he moved. With exhaustion or the obvious waves of heat, Remus was unsure. Regardless, every step carried the scent closer, and he felt himself respond by going rigid in his jeans. It was worse than the night before, more potent. He could practically taste him, and he was still a distance away. Everything in this man was crying out to Remus to go to him, to touch, to take him where he staggered. Remus fought the urge to step toward him in turn.
I wanted you to have a safe place to...
He winced when his eyes naturally darted down to the spreading wetness between the man's thighs as he drew closer.
But you're an alpha.
He said in wonder as he obviously caught the scent of Remus's desperation for him. This beautiful stranger who now smelled like him after a night in his bed. Remus felt himself throb when he realized that delicious smell would be all over his sheets. He may never wash them again.
I prefer to be known as Remus.
He smiled sheepishly, trying to diffuse the growing tension that seemed to thicken with every step the man took forward. He was close enough to reach out and touch now, and his shoulders ached with the effort it took not to do just that.
I'm serious.
The man replied softly, and Remus barely had a chance to register wide, glassy eyes, or to prepare at all before he was catching him as he barreled forward into his arms and tried to keep his bearings as he was aggressively scented.
Oh.
Sirius moaned appreciatively with a sound like a freight train running into him. It hit him in the chest, and when he pressed his face against Remus's neck, he felt like he might collapse, or hulk out. There was no in-between. He shuddered as he smelled his own woody scent combined with Sirius's buttery, rich flavor, coating his mouth like a film as he breathed it in gulps.
Oh God, you smell so good. Sirius. I woke up and I smelled like you, but you weren't there.
He sounded desperate, whining, dripping like melted butter off a pancake that mixed with sticky syrup, and Remus was hungry.
Sirius.
He panted desperately as fevered fingers shook against his sides as they touched, gripped, and pulled at him.
What?
You're in heat.
If it were possible, Sirius pressed even closer, and Remus found his own hands on Sirius's waist, almost against his will. He was a live wire under his fingers, hot and trembling.
I know. I ran away from my family. Which?
He struggled for control, trying to breathe through his mouth, but still reacting to the current that shot through him as Sirius's fingers found their way under his jumper and onto his skin.
Which means you didn't actually want this exact scenario.
To his credit, Sirius seemed to think about that, but then Remus felt a wet tongue against his skin, and his knees actually shook. His fingers flexed against Sirius's waist, and he felt him hum.
They wanted to sell me.
Sirius purred when he pressed his hips against Remus's, rocking against him almost like he couldn't help it.
You took care of me.
The surge of protective anger that shot through him, along with an involuntary growl at the thought of Sirius being sold like livestock, saw Remus tighten his grip against him and press his face into the warm, sweaty curls now freely flowing around Sirius's face. His control was hanging on by the barest thread at this point, and he was breathing in before he could think any better of it. And then Sirius was rummaging. There was no other word for it. His hands were everywhere, running over Remus's lumpy jumper until he suddenly lifted it and ducked under it, pressing his nose to Remus's armpit.
That doesn't mean that you really want this.
Remus said gruffly, unable to help the way his body was responding to this behavior, especially when he felt hot breath against his chest.
But I do.
Sirius whined, popping his head out, mussing his curls adorably with the static. It was a tidy metaphor. This man was electric.
You don't know that, sweetheart.
Remus said softly. He took him gently by the chin.
Your instincts are doing this. Do you even know what that means?
Sirius's eyes were wide as he looked up at him, saucer-like, reflecting the dying light of the sunset outside the barn back to Remus in pools of silver. He looked so small and vulnerable in the cool air, and Remus just wanted to tuck him closer again, to take care of him. And then Sirius opened his mouth to speak, and Remus was lost at his words.
You could show me.
Sirius could see the moment that something snapped in Remus. His eyes focused on him with a kind of predatory laser focus. He stepped forward and Sirius stepped back instinctively with him, shivering in anticipation and desperation as another wave of heat roiled through him at that look. His stomach clenched, and he felt a fresh gush of slick between his already tacky thighs. He saw Remus's nostrils flare and knew he could smell it too.
You want me to show you?
Sirius nodded, breath coming out in a pant as the scent of him went from desperate and held back to a kind of determined want, animalistic and deliberate. He felt it surround him like a kind of cloud of pheromones, and it was like being wrapped in that duvet again, but he still wanted more.
Please, Alpha Remus.
He clutched the woolen jumper in his fists and encouraged him to come closer.
Please, it hurts. Your scent, you make it better, even last night.
He found himself backed up against a hay bale, bracketed in with the smell of sweet hay and earthy goodness and pinned under the softest, most lethal smile he'd ever seen, pleased at Sirius's words. He had to crane his neck up to see into Remus's eyes. He kept talking, terrified that Remus would stop, that he'd be left to deal with this alone.
I was alone and cold and scared, and then you found me, and suddenly it was all better.
He raised onto his toes and tried to reach that spot that smelled best, nuzzling into Remus's neck under his scent gland and panting in a breath of pleased and aroused alpha like it was pure oxygen.
Even your scent, my family, all the alphas, I hated how they smelled.
And to his relief, Remus pressed closer. He pressed his palm to Sirius's head to hold him in place against his collarbone and slid his knee between Sirius's legs, making him groan when it brushed his throbbing, swollen cock.
You like my smell?
Remus asked. Sirius nodded, mouthing over the skin exposed by the distressed neck of the jumper, pressing closer and rolling his hips, looking for friction.
You smell clean.
Sirius gasped in a lungful.
Like outside, and warmth and hay and fire. It's fucking addictive.
I'm addictive.
Remus groaned, nuzzling into Sirius's hair, fingers brushing over the scent gland and making him shiver and purr. He knew Remus could smell how much he wanted him.
Do you have any idea how you smell? I'd drink you in a glass if I could.
The knees Sirius was grinding against disappeared, and he whimpered until he realized that Remus had suddenly dropped to his knees in the sawdust on the floor of the barn, pressing his face into the front of Sirius's pants.
That smell.
Remus gasped, and Sirius steadied himself with his hands on Remus's shoulders. His big hands were running up and down Sirius's thighs, soothing and caressing reverently.
If I could bottle it and keep it under my pillow, I would.
And then he was looking up at Sirius, eyes searching for something.
I can help.
He said tightly.
I can help you through this.
He swallowed.
Can you trust me?
Sirius was nodding before he'd even finished his question. He didn't understand why, but he did.
Yes.
He managed.
Please make it better.
Remus tugged at the sodden joggers then, working them down over Sirius's hips and exposing him to the cool air. He had no time to feel cold, though, as his tacky, throbbing length was immediately taken into Remus's mouth.
Fuck.
Sirius cried out in response. He grabbed Remus's hair for stability, and then felt him moan around him as he took him to the root in one go and sucked as he pulled off with a pop.
Okay.
Remus asked, hands roaming over Sirius's thighs until they found themselves dipping into the cleft of his arse, kneading and squeezing.
Yeah.
Sirius whined.
I just wasn't expecting.
That I'd actually want to taste?
Remus teased. He removed one of the hands steadily gathering the trickling slick from the source and raised his fingers, glossy with Sirius's arousal, to his mouth, sucking the liquid off his fingers with an expression of ecstasy. Sirius's knees actually buckled when Remus growled in satisfaction at the taste, and Remus was standing in a second, ready to catch him. He caught Sirius up under the knees and carried him to a stack of hay around waist high with a blanket spread over them. When he placed Sirius down, his legs hanging over the edge, and he was once again surrounded by the scent he'd woken up to. That sweet, soothing scent of the farm and the outdoors. Desperate for more, Sirius caught Remus's hand and yanked him down to him, kicking his track pants off impatiently, and then trapping Remus close with his legs around his waist.
Stop teasing.
He begged.
You said you'd help me. I need you.
Remus's surprised expression softened and he nodded, tucking a strand of Sirius's wild curls behind his ear.
I'm going to look after you, baby.
He comforted.
How could I not?
Sirius arched against him, bucking his hips for friction, and feeling the fat tears of frustration welling in his eyes at the fact that he was still so empty.
Oh.
Remus cooed, using his thumbs to swipe them away as they fell.
Oh, sweetheart, don't cry.
He leaned down and pressed a kiss to Sirius's forehead before burying his face in his neck, scenting him and running his teeth along the scent gland before pulling back as if realizing what he was doing. A fresh flood of slick gushed from him, and Sirius whined, high and needy with it. Then Remus pulled back and looked at Sirius. Through the haze of frustration and want and fever, Sirius could see his pupils were blown as he licked his lips.
Can I kiss you?
He asked. Sirius stared for a second, and then he was clawing at Remus's hair, pressing him closer and meeting him for a desperate kiss. And for the barest moment, Sirius's brain stopped chasing fullness. He stopped writhing, his grip softening and mouth going soft as Remus manipulated them. Strong arms wriggled under and around him, pressing Sirius close and slanting his mouth to direct and deepen the kiss. When Remus climbed over him, though, Sirius's brain caught up and he moaned deeply as the broader-framed man covered him. He was strong, holding Sirius off the mattress to him as Sirius clung to him like a koala. He began to rut his hips again as the kiss turned sloppy and wet, and Remus's growl began deep in his chest as he met each roll of his hips with one of his own. It felt animalistic, possessive, like Remus was finally about to fulfill his promise. And then he broke away, and Sirius cried out at the loss.
Hush.
Remus tutted as he straightened up.
I can't fuck you if you're the only one who's naked.
That got his attention. Remus placed him reverently back onto the blanket and stepped back as Sirius got his elbows under him, watching hungrily as Remus began to unbuckle his belt. Remus smirked when he saw him looking, and divested himself of his top with the deliberate slowness of someone who really quite liked teasing when all was said and done. Instead of flinging it the way of Sirius's joggers, though, he threw it into the hay next to Sirius, who immediately pulled off the one he'd got from the hamper and replaced it with the one Remus had given him with his fresh scent. Before he did, he pressed his face into the wool and inhaled deeply. Then he realized he was probably missing the main event and quickly shoved it on, popping his head through the neck hole and finding Remus standing and watching him with an approving smile as he palmed himself through his jeans. He still had his bottoms on, and Sirius suddenly found his knees under him, and he was crawling forward until he was facing his bulging crotch. He was sure he was drenching the woolen blanket under him at this point, but he swore the slick pooled even quicker as he nuzzled the soft brown fluff that trailed up from Remus's open flies to his navel as Remus hummed. He inhaled and darted his tongue out, trailing the tip up from the band of underwear he could see all the way up to the point between Remus's pecs before he was stopped with a hand cradling his chin. Sirius looked up and Remus leaned down to kiss him, and this time it was hard, almost commanding in the way it claimed his lips like a promise of what was to come. He broke them apart soon after it began and fixed Sirius with a look he could feel in his toes.
Lay back.
Throughout his life, Sirius had always heard the alpha voice used in a threatening way. He'd been taught to expect its use to command him to serve his alpha, but when Remus used it then and he responded, scrambling back to follow the order and letting his legs drop open, it was only to find Remus crawling onto the hay bed and kneeling between his legs, nuzzling at the wetness between his thighs.
What are you? Hush.
Remus said softly.
I'm going to look after you.
Then there were fingers gently circling the sensitive and already slackened ring of muscle around his entrance, and Sirius barely had time to process what was happening before one was slipping inside at the same time as Remus took him into his mouth again.
Oh shit.
Sirius sobbed, clenching around the finger inside him, and clutching at the sheets as his back arched off the blanket in relief for the emptiness being addressed.
Oh fuck, Remus, Alpha, more.
Remus hummed out a groan as he bobbed his head over Sirius's length, dragging his tongue over him as he took him deeper and hollowing his cheeks as he pulled off again. The finger inside him was joined with a second, working overtime, curling inside him and groping as if they were looking for something. And Sirius was inconsolable, practically babbling and drooling with the intensity of the sensation. The white-hot, full-body pleasure of Remus's mouth on him, and the satisfaction at knowing he would soon be a lot fuller, making him buck against Remus's hand, blindly looking for more. And then Remus found whatever he was looking for. His finger pressed against something inside Sirius that made him come instantly, the pleasure overtaking him like a riptide. He came back to himself to find Remus utterly naked now and kneeling between his legs again, stroking the most incredible cock that Sirius had ever seen, hard and dripping, and all for him. He was scrambling, sluggish and clumsy, to flip over and present before he even understood what he was doing, but Remus stopped him with a gentle but insistent hand to Sirius's shoulder, holding him in place and encouraging him onto his back again. At Sirius's confused look, he just smiled. It was a dangerous smile, one that said that Remus knew something he didn't.
I can't watch you come again if you've got a mouthful of hay.
He crawled over Sirius again and leaned in to kiss him, letting Sirius's hands wander where he pleased, feeling the lines of functional muscle and the lines of scar tissue here and there as Remus licked into his mouth. He felt incredible, warm and strong and safe, and he needed him more than he needed air in his lungs. He broke away.
I need your knot, Alpha.
He groaned, pressing Remus closer by the small of his back. Remus looked over him carefully, but his eyes betrayed how badly he wanted it too. When he saw nothing but Sirius's sincerity, he nodded and gathered Sirius's slick onto his length before positioning himself at his entrance and pushing inside without further ceremony, just a steady and insistent press. Sirius's eyes rolled back into his head and he moaned when he heard,
That's it, little Omega. You're doing so well, sweetheart. Taking me so well.
Remus was big, bigger than the fingers he'd used earlier, and bigger than anything else Sirius had managed to stuff in there in his more desperate moments over the years. The prep and the slick helped, but it was still a stretch, though one that felt so right it made him laugh in relief.
Fuck, your laugh is like music.
Remus sobbed as he bottomed out and let his head drop into Sirius's neck, sucking unabashedly now on his scent gland. He nearly blacked out in pleasure.
Feels so good, Remus.
Sirius cried, already rolling his hips and grinding upward to adjust, loving the hot heat of him filling him the way he'd been desperate for.
You're so perfect.
Remus growled as he fucked forward roughly, finally losing hold of whatever control he had left.
So hot and tight and beautiful for me. Such a quick study.
For you.
Sirius agreed with a whine.
Only for you, Alpha. Teach me to take your knot.
Oh fuck, say it again.
Alpha.
And the other part?
He insisted, picking up his speed and filling the barn with the sound of wet slapping as his balls hit the back of Sirius's thighs with each thrust.
Only for you, Alpha.
Sirius sobbed, his climax quickly approaching again as Remus sped up his thrusts, and he felt the base of the cock hammering into him begin to swell.
I'm yours to knot.
Remus buried himself to the hilt with a roar that shook the rafters and forced the knot inside as he came. Sirius came again as he felt himself being filled, his fingernails digging into Remus's back as he yelled his release and held him close with his ankles crossed at his lower back. At length, he felt the feverish desperation subside with the knot wedged firmly inside him, and found himself being scented by Remus dragging his stubble against his scent gland. It sent aftershocks of pleasure rippling through him as he clenched around the knot, milking him for all he had, feeling full at last. It was then that he noticed that there was a gap in the roof above where he was lying, Remus still mouthing and sucking over his neck and under his gland as if in a trance. Sirius could see the night sky through that gap, and he swore his own star winked at him as he stared, feeling a contentment settle in as he let himself succumb to a moment of rest with a heavy weight on top of him. As he drifted off, he had the barest thought to make a wish that he'd never have to go anywhere else ever again. Eventually, Remus's knot deflated, and he carried Sirius from the cold barn to his room in the house. They'd fucked again in sheets that smelled like Sirius's preheat, and then Remus had cleaned them up, and fetched them both some food from the oven. After a well-earned bowl of stew, they'd done another round with Sirius gracelessly riding Remus in his reading chair before falling asleep on his knot as Remus held him close and safe. In a lull between waves of heat, they lay together and finally had the first proper conversation they'd had not directly under the influence of hormones or frostbite. Remus dragged his fingers over Sirius's bare, sweaty back, pressing his lips into his tangled hair.
Where were you running to?
I had no idea.
Sirius sighed, snuggling closer, dragging his face over Remus's stubbly neck.
I just couldn't be there.
What do you want to do when your heat is over?
Sirius looked up at him in alarm, and Remus hurried to reassure him, smelling the burned edges of anxiety in his scent as he misunderstood.
I'm not trying to get rid of you. You're welcome here for as long as you'd like. I'm trying to tell you I can help you.
You're helping me now.
Sirius protested, sitting up a little to look down at Remus. Remus rolled his eyes at his petulant pout and yanked him down before rolling them over to pin him underneath. Sirius squeaked, but his legs came around Remus naturally, a shiver indicating a new wave was imminent.
And I'm enjoying it very much.
He smirked. He leaned down and kissed Sirius long and slow until he was sighing in contentment, and his scent was back to rich pastry glazed with honey.
I don't want to go anywhere.
Sirius said when they broke apart, unconsciously rolling his hips up to meet Remus's. Remus could smell fresh slick.
I didn't know it could be like this.
He said, eyes earnest and wide with something that bordered on devotion.
I want all of this.
He looked all around them. At the rickety old barn Remus had been meaning to reshingle, and the hay, which doubled as a bed on nights when they had guests, or else the house was too warm until his eyes settled back onto Remus and softened even further.
I want you. I want to be your omega.
Remus's alpha preened and roared with satisfaction at that, and before he knew it, he was kissing Sirius breathless again, nipping and sucking as if to devour him whole.
Does that mean you want me too?
He asked when they were on their sides, facing one another with Sirius's leg hitched up over Remus's hip. Remus laughed at the ridiculousness of the question.
You're my 1 in a million, Sirius.
He gave gently.
My needle in the haystack. If you want to stay, I'm only too happy to keep you.
It was Sirius's turn to roll his eyes, but the scent that came off him was one of utter pleasure.
What's your mum gonna say?
Sirius asked a little shyly.
Probably something like, I told you so.
He snorted, and at Sirius's confused look, he rushed to elaborate.
I have a bit of a habit of finding treasure in the hay. She may have suggested that you might be the best one yet.
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora, Caliana, and Flowerhawk.